And we are back on the build phase. I'm Mr. Ben, and today we are going to attempt to look at the silver lining on the dark cloud that has rolled through. Now, I will, of course, acknowledge up front that for some players in some parts of the world, there isn't much of a silver lining here. It's all bad news. The announcement that we got is the equivalent of the game ending for their part of the world, and that there's no shine, there's no spin that can be put on that. That sucks. But I don't want to only focus on the negative parts of the announcement. I did a whole show kind of breaking down the frustrating, insulting elements of that announcement. But today I want to talk about potentially the upsides to what's happening to our game. So to begin with, there are people who just flat out don't engage at the local game store whatsoever for this game. They order their sets through Upper Deck Store or Miniature Market or wherever. Now, you're not going to be able to do Miniature Market anymore. You're going to have to do Upper Deck Store. So that is a little bit of a change, but it's less of a change than for those of us who have bought our stuff at the store for the majority of a decade. And for those players, really not a whole heck of a lot is changing. And I think it's probably worth saying, before I go any further, we don't know the truth of why this is happening, but I don't think we need to put on much of a tinfoil hat. It seems very obvious. Yes, this is speculation, but I don't think it's like wild speculation. I think given the data points, it's not super difficult to come to the conclusion that Versus is not a cash cow, and distribution probably isn't making, it may not be losing Upper Deck money, but it's probably not hitting whatever profit margin it needs to. So changing the game to be cheaper to make was most likely the alternative that was on the table versus outright canceling the game. Again, I don't know this to be the case, but let's look at the data points, and let's just, for the sake of argument, for the sake of this podcast, I'm going to assume that that's the truth. Well, if that's the truth, then we should be having a much different reaction. Like, yes, again, I fully acknowledge this is bad news for some parts of the world. Like, it's horrible news, it's devastating news. But if the options on the table for Upper Deck were cancel the game outright or let the game survive in this diminished fashion to keep it alive for the hardcore audience, while yes, getting the cards is probably going to be difficult / impossible for people in certain parts of the world, the fact is the game lives. And that is maybe not necessarily celebration. That might be a little bit strong of a word, but it's cause for positivity, to be sure. If the alternative is no Versus, hey, we are not living in the world with no Versus. We're living in the reality where we have a diminished Versus, but the game continues. And I think that's a good thing. That's an awesome thing. Again, I realize there's some American privilege here where I get to say, hey, this is awesome. And to people in Canada or South America or Europe, this is cold comfort, because it's no comfort at all. It doesn't help those players, and I acknowledge that. That's true. I can't put a polish or a spin on it for people in those parts of the world. But I went on and on about that last episode. This episode, I'm trying to look at the silver lining. So I just want to acknowledge the difference between Versus being a dead game and Versus being a game with narrow distribution is pretty significant. I would argue that's maybe one of the most significant differences that you could possibly have. There is nothing that can happen to the game. There is no other difference between anything that can be as significant as the difference between having the game / not having the game. So I can't ignore, it would be foolish of us to ignore that there's something there. Next, and I want to give credit to Joseph, JLI Curve Deck on Discord. I don't remember the exact phrasing here, but the sentiment was something along the lines of, if, again, I'm going to have to speculate here a little bit, but just bear with me for the sake of argument. If the calculation that Upper Deck has done is, look, we're giving up on Versus being a mass market game. It's not going to appeal to a mass audience. We're not going to try to make it appeal to a mass audience. We're not going to market it to try to suck in new players. We are just accepting the fact that this is a small game with an extremely rabid hardcore fan base. So we're going to continue to make the game for those hardcore players. They will predictably purchase X amount of product. We can essentially take on less risk, less profit margin, but less investment means less risk. And the net outcome of that, the what could be a very positive outcome of that, is Upper Deck now isn't trying to make a game that appeals to necessarily new players. They're making a game that appeals to us, potentially, which means we could be getting a much more hardcore, intense version of Versus. Like, you know, if what they've done before with sets like Civil War, and I like the Civil War set, but let's be real, this was a version of Versus that's been stepped on a few times. It's been diluted down to make it digestible by a mass audience. It was an entry point for players. If they're giving up on trying to new player acquisition, if they're giving up on that and they're focusing on existing player retention, well, what's a great way to do that? You just give us more and more of what we already want. So the sets that we get post this change could end up being even more super awesome games than the previous sets have been super awesome games. The wacky, the weird, a lot of the stuff that we are here for as hardcore Versus players, the bizarre play 3 decks at an event kind of nonsense, are they going to be kind of let off the hook a little bit to do more of this stuff that might not be appealing to and maybe even repellent of a new player trying to get into this game? I'm thinking back to the Fantastic Battles, and as much as I love that box, there is stuff in that box that makes it really hard for a new player to jump into with that box. If they're no longer trying to do, hey, here's an entry point, they're accepting that they just are going to cater to existing customers, we could get some of the craziest, most intense, like instead of having the stepped on street Versus, we're going to have the, I'm not sure I should have gone with this metaphor, we're going to have the intense straight from Columbia Versus. And that's an exciting prospect. That could be really, really cool. Now, of course, Upper Deck is going to have to rely on the community, much like the Destiny 2 or the Warframe communities are relied on by those games developers to onboard new players. So anytime a new player discovers Versus, it's going to be completely inscrutable to them without the community there to guide people. And I would argue this is one of the things that our community has been best at. You know, Upper Deck kind of relied on us to market the game. We have not done such a great job at that. We really haven't. Like new player acquisition, as good as it was last year, it's never been excellent for Versus. The game has always grown kind of slow and steady, and clearly that's not doing what it needs to do sales-wise for Upper Deck to continue as things had been. So we've got this new release model, and I'm hopeful that if the plan is to just kind of continue this as almost like a boutique or like a niche game for a hardcore, dedicated, small number of people, that they're just going to up the intensity of what they're giving us, up the weirdness, up the wacky, up the super awesome games I don't know, up the Wyatt Wingfoot, Franklin Richards, Deadpool, like all the really weird stuff. Like, we're going to get more of it. And then, you know, if somebody somehow stumbles across the Upper Deck store and sees this game and is like, oh, this looks cool, I want to learn how to play, then the community can kind of step in and be like, hey, this is the point where the game got real weird. You might want to start back here with Civil War to kind of onboard yourself. And that's a role that I think the community could definitely serve. So those are kind of positive. And I think there's plenty of room to look at this announcement in both kinds of ways. I love the game of Versus. I want to be here for the game of Versus, and I certainly don't want to do something that's going to hurt the game. I also don't want to be like Pollyanna about what's happening and just cheerfully pretend that there's nothing wrong. But I did the show with my initial reaction to the corporate doublespeak announcement that they made. And here I'm trying to take, well, if we just ignore the bad stuff, So I guess this show is going to sound a little Pollyanna. If we just ignore the bad stuff or the potential negatives, what are some positives that can come out of this? And arguably, the two things that I've listed so far kind of play hand in hand, where giving us the version of Versus that the established player base loves and giving it to us in a more intense, less diluted fashion is probably going to do wonders for existing player retention, assuming you're an American. And on top of that, the lowered investment and lowered risk probably means, I have to imagine they've already calculated in the fact that they're going to lose the international audience. So they have figured, the game can continue to exist this way. And it could mean that the game will continue to exist this way for a long time into the future. Again, contracting is never a good sign, but I think we can also be honest about the types of engagement that this game gets. It's hard to get a local game scene going around this game. I have tried. It's hard to get the prize support from Upper Deck other than the OP kits that the stores can just buy. But like anything else, like League promos to do Hobby League around, those are extremely difficult to get. And it never should have been that way. I know some stores have not had a problem getting it, but I mean, I've been trying for years to get something going around my locals. Every time they say, hey, stores, email us, see if we want to get a regional. It could be that my store is located too close to Milwaukee, and there's a big Versus event there every year. So maybe they just don't want a store in Iowa because it doesn't spread them out geographically enough. I don't know, but I just know that we've had these problems. So if Upper Deck is now kind of officially saying what a lot of us have kind of felt for a long time, that this game isn't a great fit for the LGS, and it's costing more money than it's worth to try to maintain that presence. That's sad for some of us, to be sure. Really sad for some of us, depending on what your zip code is or country of origin. But the game is not completely gone, and maybe the version of the game that we see from here on out is going to appeal even harder to those of us that really care deeply. If a lot of players are already buying from Upper Deck store, this isn't a huge change for them. I mean, it's changed for me, to be sure. I still haven't bought Children of Lilith because, man, I got to go onto the Upper Deck store to do that. But at some point, I'll get there. This could have some positives coming out of this, despite all the stuff that I talked about in the last show. So that's kind of where I'm landing. I'm trying to look towards the future with some hope about what the game might hold for some percentage of the audience. And potentially there would be a way that we could figure out some kind of secondary market way to get these expansions out to other people. I don't know. I feel like that's really an Upper Deck problem. Solving international shipping should not be that difficult. But hopefully something will come up so that the demand for international is clearly there. Hopefully Upper Deck sees that and is able to address it in some way. Overall, I'm still going to be here talking about Versus. There's certainly cards and events on the horizon, and we don't want to completely lose focus on things amidst this jarring news that we received. So I want to just be honest about all sides of it. And sometimes that means criticism, and sometimes that means looking forward with some optimism. So that's what we're here for. I'm Mr. Ben. This has been The Build Phase, and you should go win some games.